Hello, Ebony.
Hi, Eric.
How you doing?
I'm good.
Excellent. So you're in Chicago,
I am.
and I'm in Durham,
Yep.
but we have Jamaica in the house as well. So I'd really like for you to talk a little bit about Jamaica for our audience, your home, your source of inspiration, and I'm thinking in particular about that photograph that's in the exhibition catalog of you and your great grandmother in St. Andrew Parish.
My great grandmother, Henrietta Garvey, also called Mother Gav affectionately, in her community, but by everybody who was in the family, we all just called her Mama. The photograph was actually in the garden, in the front yard of my parents' home, or the home that they shared, that they both shared then. It's the only photograph that I have of the two of us together. She died when I was quite young. I was like 8 or 9, so many of the memories that I have of her are few, and the stories that I know of her have been passed on through family members. And so many times when I hear about her, I understand the person that my mother is. I often, as I've gotten more senior in my years, I often refer to my mother as my home. So when I think about home, I first think about my mother. I think about her because it's the first site or first soil of nourishment. It's the first place I learned how to, it's the first source of love I had. It's the first place I lived in before I, physically came to join everybody else on this other mass. And Jamaica, I miss it all the time. I grew up, I was born in Kingston. A lot of people will say, when you ask them if they come from Kingston, they'll say they were born in Kingston, but or they'll say, when somebody says they're born in St. Andrew, most of the times it's really that they were born in Kingston, because there are not that many hospitals where people actually are born in St. Andrew. But, Kingston and St. Andrew, it's a twinned parish. And so Kingston tends to be where like a lot of commerce happens. But at the same time, there's also a lot of neighborhoods. There are a lot of working class neighborhoods. While in St. Andrew, it's a mix. Yes, there is commerce. There are also working class neighborhoods, and next to every to most, if not all working class neighborhoods, there are also middle class or wealthier neighborhoods. And so it's interesting to think about this, the way people live across this space. The other thing also too, that people are always surprised by when they come to Jamaica, or especially when they come to Kingston. Kingston is, I always say, not I always say, Kingston is the creative capital of the world, if America is an economic superpower, then Jamaica is a cultural superpower. And that is not an if, an and, or a but, it's just a fact. So what's been wonderful about growing up in Jamaica, or coming to a sense of self, especially in a place like Kingston, and especially as a young woman, having roots from both of my parents who came from rural poverty, who then, like many people in their generation, would have come to Kingston to seek opportunities. What I always think is really amazing about thinking about this kind of personal family history, and against the backdrop that is that is Jamaica, and more specifically Kingston and St. Andrews, that everything and anything is possible. There's a reason why you can find a Jamaican anywhere. So if in the end, when the world ends, one of the last people standing will definitely be people from my soil. We are
so
everywhere.
On the subject of Jamaicans everywhere, you mentioned your great-grandmother's name, Henrietta Garvey.
Yes.
Is it true? Are you connected to that story and that history and that amazing figure of the early 20th century, Marcus Garvey?
So in my recent adult life, I have come to understand, the name Garvey is not a popular name. In Jamaica, it's not a common name, like say Brown or Stewart, so it's not a very common name. My great grandmother, she was born in Lower Trelawney in a town called Lorimer's. But where my mother grew up, even though my great grandmother was born there, my mother was born there, but then my great grandmother moved the family to Stewart Town, which is the upper end of Trelawney, so closer to the coast. Trelawney also borders St. Anne, and she had family living in St. Anne. She had a sibling who was living in St. Anne also too. In my recent adult years, I was told by an aunt that my great-grandmother had shared with her bits of her early life, that around, I think, age 7 or 8, that she and Marcus apparently were playmates, and that we might be second or third or fourth cousins. But she used to call him not Marcus, but Masai. And that's how she used to refer to him. But where this happened, we're not quite sure. I do know for a short period of time, she had actually lived in Kingston when she was quite young. It seems that her mom was unable to care for her. Also too, she came from a working class background in the country. She was sent to family in town who would have been thought to have taken better care of her. And then later on in her life, whoever her relative was that was taking care of her in Kingston had passed. What was interesting to me learning about the story, where my great-grandmother had lived in her short years in Kingston as a young person, is just down the street from my father's home, the home that my father and my mother had shared, and where I had grown up. So when it's always interesting that when I think about Jamaica, I always think about Jamaica, or even, I always think about Jamaica as like this really big place. And then when you start to realize the connections and how small they are, is how much smaller it makes the place feel. In some ways, it's almost like a village, but it's a village that's spread out across a wide geography.
Much of our audience might be wondering, well, why are we talking about genealogy? Why are we talking about family? Why are we talking about place? But as far as I'm concerned, these ideas are really central to your work, and they really resonate quite a bit with your installation that just closed here at the Nasher. So I'd like to kind of shift a little bit to that installation. And I wanted to ask you about your inspiration for In the Garden.
Well, so the inspiration actually came after being invited to do an exhibition at the Museum of Art and Design. So there was a show that I had called Dead Treez, which had traveled from the Cola Art Center in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, that was curated by Karen Patterson, no relation. But so she was invited to bring the show to the Museum of Art and Design by then newly minted chief curator Shannon Stratton. And so Shannon had come to Sheboygan to see the show at the Cola and thought that she wanted to bring the show to the museum. And then in addition to that, at the time, she had also started this project in the Tiffany galleries, where they would show selections of objects from the collection. And what they decided to do to kind of shift the possibilities of how an exhibition could happen is to invite an artist to do an intervention or to curate a selection of objects. And it was called the Artist's Point of View. So the Dead Trees exhibition, the galleries it occupied was sitting directly across from the Tiffany galleries. And so I thought, what could I do to bring these two moments together so that they don't feel, like separate things, but somehow that they're in conversation with each other. And at the time, the works in the Dead Trees show were all floor-based works. They were all works that were largely inspired by photographs of underreported deaths or murders that were circulating on social media at the time. And those I took inspiration from those photographs and then staged scenarios in my studio in Kingston, where I worked with a number of models and a photographer to photograph these models overhead. So the idea was, what would happen if I pulled that moment from a flat work and then popped it in full dimension where people would have to walk in and around. And so that show was such the opportunity to make that work. The work I actually named it after a line in Olive Senior's poem called Brief Lives, but the project was called Buried Again to Carry On Growing. So within the vitrines, I had a number of fake plants that all had poisonous properties. Over 60 or so objects from the collection were kind of thrown throughout the bushes. And as one would walk and see the objects from the collection, one would happen upon a body that seemed to be nestled in this overgrowth. And so when the Pérez had approached me about doing a show, I mean, this project was still on my mind from 2015, wrestling with this notion of thinking about spaces of burial, thinking about the garden, thinking about the bush as a site, thinking about things being concealed, by foliage. And so I thought, what would happen then if I could pull what was happening in the vitrines out into the space? And thinking also too about what is the garden metaphorically for me? At least at the time, I was thinking about the garden as the grave. So the question was, what would happen if I could get the audience to walk through the grave?
Wow. As you were describing your process and the subject, I have to say I was thinking about my travels to Jamaica. I had a professor in college who said, no, not Montego Bay, no Ocho Rios, you must go to Kingston, because that is where culture is. That is where the art schools are. That is where the dance is. That is where the music, is made. And I remember in the early 2000s driving from Kingston through Spanish Town, the site of Grace Jones's birth, and all the way up to Ocho Rios. And as you were talking, I'm thinking about urban Jamaica with concrete and asphalt and noise and cars, but then within a matter of hours, you are in this lush kind of world of vegetation and foliage and animals and then you also have both the forest itself, but then you also have the water. So this is a place where clearly your work seems to be kind of talking to all of these components, not just the lush, but the urban and the gritty as well.
Well, Rick, it depends. It depends on which direction you go. Because
Okay.
if you are in Kingston, or if you are, let us say, if you are by the University of the West Indies, which is in St. Andrew, right, near to Papine, one just goes up the hill, and that's not an hour. That's just about 20 minutes, and you're already in the middle of the vegetation, going up to what's called East Rural St. Andrew. I think that's the proper geography. I could be off. But it's, rural. It's a part of rural St. Andrew. And that's actually one of my favorite treks to go alone, is to go up into the mountains and to traverse. And it's interesting because in my younger years, I had absolutely no interest in plant life. In fact, I think that when I think about the garden in my younger years, it was a burden, it was a chore. And also too, my mother was in charge of, the garden was my mother's space, when she and my father had shared that home. And when they had split, I would have to water this thing that was never cared for, and I detested. So it's kind of interesting then thinking about, coming to think about this space later on in my life, and then having come to it by navigating really, trying to sift through personal experiences, and then thinking about that in a much broader scope.
But when you're talking about the garden, and I'm looking at your work, it's clear that human bodies, have a kind of a resonance, or at least a metaphor, with the flowers and nature themselves. And I'm thinking about quite a few of your works, particularly the earlier works of yours that looked at urban youth, and the way you created these images of them with these elongated necks, and the feathers and the leaves and the flowers that seem to be kind of popping out of their bodies. It's almost as if in that early work you were already thinking about the garden, but you were really kind of connecting it to real lives and real people who often get kind of dismissed as just kind of thugs and street people. But these are people who are beautiful, who are floral in their own way.
Right. I mean, when I came to start making that, that work was kind of off another cusp. As a younger artist, I was always interested in ideas around beauty. Always interested in conversations around beauty and the grotesque. So when I was in grad school, when I was in undergrad, I was examining my own body and looking at this language. And then after a while, it just, for me, I felt like whatever questions I had autobiographically, I'd already concluded them. And I'm like, who cares about looking at pictures of my vagina? I mean, let's just fucking move on, And so I came across this article that talked about criminals. It was in the Jamaica Star. This was around 2007. And the question, the article was about criminals lightening their skins as a way of eluding the police. And I just thought, what a clever way of taking control over your body and then kind of shape shifting, right? But then also too, thinking about the language of skin lightening and its place as its place in terms of the language of beauty, and then also to thinking about the practice in relation to women, but it's being practiced by men. And then thinking about that in relation to Jamaica, which is this hyper masculine society. And then also too, at the time, it was already, a little popular that men were lightening their skins. It was also the period of the term metrosexual was very popular. So there was already afoot this reimagination around the masculine. But I thought it was interesting that things that were considered to be feminine tropes were what was being used to reimagine the masculine, and kind of watching these kind of fights or contradictions kind of play out, but on the male form. So because of my interest in the grotesque, immediately I was like also interested in like this idea that one is also using this incredibly violent act to strip the skin. It is an act of violence, but then also too, thinking about it in terms of agency. So the people who are largely practicing skin lightening were working class people. And in thinking about, the socio hierarchy of shade, and what that meter means, and as it relates to beauty in terms of the measurement around whiteness, the darker you are, the less beautiful you're seen within that spectrum. But then also considering too, in terms of a socioeconomic connection, the darker you are is also thought to be the lower you are on the socioeconomic tier. So then what does it mean then for these young working class men to kind of think about these things or these notions and to erase themselves into presence? And it was always interesting that it would always largely be the face, and a lot of it had to do with economics. It's just the creams were expensive. Some people were really creative and they would make their own concoctions. But the long and short of it is that it all costs money. But the idea that, the face was what was illuminated, and then thinking about the remaining parts of the body having the original skin was always, and I always thought was like a really interesting contrast. And then also too, thinking about how lightning also related to or was considered in relation to camera light. So people go to parties, and in the same way they would prepare outfits to go to a party, they would also prepare their skins in the same way, but with the consideration around camera light, that somehow the flashiness or the shininess of skin in relation to the shininess of clothes means that the camera is going to pick me up and then catapult me out into the stratosphere beyond my small community or my locality here in this place, out into the globe, and to be picked up. And so I just in thinking about going back to the images, it's almost as if there is a decision to create a kind of demigodness around them. They become almost like demigods. And so I wanted to think about all of those formalities of the jarringness of the viewing, but also to what does it also do?
Well, speaking of beauty and speaking of corporeality and the divine, I'm thinking about two of the films that are a part of your installation. One is called The Observation of the Bush Cockerel Project, a fictitious historical narrative. And then you have another one called Three Kings Weep. And I'd love for you to just share a little bit about your interest in film, but also filming the Black body.
Yeah, the observation actually came out of an experiment. It seemed that I would make these bodies of work, and then like in between I would end up doing an involved installation, and that installation was kind of a way of figuring out all the kinks that I wasn't able to get out of that body of work. And so because I think at the time when I had made the Bush Cockerel Project, this is around 2012, 2011. I think I started filming in 2011, and then actually the project was finally done in 2012. But I had been thinking a lot about birds for some reason. And so I was thinking about like, what, what is the, if, thinking about the male bird, and the male bird is in contrast to the female bird, is quite beautiful. And so I started making this, weird history in my head that somehow the modern male or the modern black male is connected to the male bird. That now the black male is now somehow becoming even more beautiful than the female bird in terms of the way it's decorating or adorning its body. But I was also interested in skewing the read on what kind of assertions we would make about who was in the outfits. And it's part of the reason I obscured the models altogether. I was curious about how gesture and gender would be read, and how that would be read in that space and on those bodies. So I actually went up into the hills in St. Andrew, beyond a park called Hollywell. It's a historic site, but then it had a path that was like an unused trail or whatever, and I just went trekking 1 week before, and I came to this weird alcove and heard all of these strange noises that one definitely would not hear being on the flat in the city, and I just thought, and so then I just, I recruited these two friends of mine. I said, hey, how about we go do this thing? And then I recruited another friend of mine to shoot for me. And I took a small bag with a couple of artificial flowers just so that I could play up some contrast in the space. And then I've always loved Bill Viola's films. And I think what I've always loved about those films is that, working in video or working in film is a very, very difficult thing to do. And it's still a very, very new medium for me. I'm still understanding it. But it also requires a lot of the audience, and especially when we think about now, where our attention span is so short and we're so used to receiving images at such a high rate. And then I'm asking you to watch something that's slow and 18 minutes long, So I asked the models to walk really slow in this environment. And then there was also a smaller figure, a baby figure. That they would pass between each other. But also too, when I had first shown that project, it was at the National Gallery of Jamaica for the 2012 Biennial. I also decided that I wanted to try to have a live performance during the run of the Biennial. So I also asked the same two models along with the baby figure to participate in a performance that was in the historic galleries. So I was also interested in this idea of inserting this narrative somewhere, and that while I think at the time the Belsario show might have been up at the time, so seeing that kind of imagery, or just thinking about the larger histories that were being covered within that wing, and then also to seeing this performative work that's suggesting that this too could be a kind of history, and thinking about those juxtapositions was something I was trying to play with. But it really came out of a need to uncover another language and to play. It really came out of a moment of play.
Well, clearly Three Kings Weep has a different vibe.
It does.
Yeah, it's for the public who haven't seen this, it's an incredible, moving film of three men, and I'll let you describe it.
Well, Three Kings Weep is Three Kings Weep is a video of three young men, all sitting in a kind of chapeled space. So the scale of the videos occupy whatever the scale of the room is. It is meant to tower, almost as if walking into a church and encountering large panes of glass. but the seating also happens in a way that you are made to sit at the feet of these young men. It is a very contemplative space. And as the video opens up, you see these three men looking directly at you, and they all begin to get dressed very slowly as they weep. And then needling over the course of this 8-minute plus video is the voice of a child reading If We Must Die by Claude McKay. Sorry, I don't know why I blanked on that.
Okay.
Thank you so much. By Claude McKay. And that poem was actually written in response to McKay's reading about a number of racial killings that were happening in the South, and more specifically, it seemed to have been written in response to what was happening in Chicago. What was called Red Summer. I think that was 1919. But I was really interested in like this idea of it came out of like thinking about vulnerability. This notion of witnessing, the language of witnessing has been in the work more and more as I continue to unpack and to think about the bodies, and then to think about ways in which the audience then gets implicated in thinking about who these people are. And so Three Kings Weep for me was kind of like the last push. I remember reading this article in around 2015 that was an interview with a number of doctors at the University of Virginia that believed that that patients of color, specifically Black patients, experienced little to no pain. And I just thought this was so alarming, and that this was an article with interviews done by people in 2015. This is not some historic archive that I just now come to the fore. So then what does it mean then to be in the field of care, and then to have a presumption about the people who you are meant to care for? Then real care cannot happen. You know, like, what would it mean then for somebody to really see somebody? You know, like, what does it mean to see me? And interestingly enough, there was a project I'd done with Barney's where I kept having these figures echo, see me, but it kept happening as a demand. See me. Anyway, but so what does it really mean to do that? It's like initially when I started thinking about the film, I kept thinking about the facade. Like, what would happen if we took the facade out the way? Would that then allow people to see these young men? And then also the other reason I also wanted to juxtapose it with the voice of a child, I was also thinking about like juxtaposing two moments of vulnerability. So often when we hear about violence as it relates to black children, they're never contextualized as children, right? They're often, particularly say, for example, when we think about like police killings, or even at the time when I was like, I had just not too long finished doing our project in Jamaica, and there were a number of like killings of young people who are all largely from working class communities. Even the way they were spoken about, there was also a difference in that there was a shared similarity. They were always aged. Well, you know how those girls are, you know, that kind of thing. So then what does it mean to like put these two vulnerables together and then force the audience to see? And then I was like, well, why do they have to beg for any acknowledgement at all? These people know who they are. And is it fair for me to even do that? You know, like, we know who we are. You know, like, it's not our problem that people don't see us as who we are. It's theirs, and it's their work to do. So that's also part of the reason the video was then shown in reverse, that they were getting dressed and getting ready. And that here it is, you have the softness of a child's voice reading these really heavy words, which are a charge, which is saying, get ready. Death is imminent, but we are going to face it on our terms. And then the last thing each of them do is that they crown themselves. And when we think about the nature of crowning, a crowning is done to you. It is not done by you. So then what does it mean then to take that power and to do it to yourself? So the last three moments, one person, the middle figure crowns himself with a yellow bucket hat. I think the far right figure crowns himself with a pair of shiny gold glasses, and the far left figure crowns himself with a purple bandana that gets tied, and then it cuts on the last line and goes to black. But I wanted to be able to. It was also a slow moving video, and the whole point was I wanted that if somebody decided to get up, it was going to feel difficult. It would have felt irreverent to do so.
I want to be able to open up for some questions, but before I do, I got to ask you, since you've brought up the sartorial, I'm thinking about part of the installation entitled Stars. And for the public who hasn't seen it, it's comprised of all of these amazing shoes that are in glitter, and they are hanging above our heads, and well, yes, why stars?
I actually made stars thinking about the show. Like, what I'm giving the audience all of this information here on the ground, and what would happen if the audience were to look up and there was a surprise. But I've also been interested in this idea around public memorials, how ordinary people mark spaces to commemorate the passing of loved ones. And so one of the things that people do in working class neighborhoods is that they'll, like sometimes people will buy flowers. You'll see these little street side memorials. But sometimes people will also throw a pair of shoes on a shoe line. Of course, the shoe line has two sides to it, but I'm sticking to the side that most interested me was the act of it being a memorial. And that part of the reason that people would throw the shoe on the shoe line is that the soul would get closer to heaven, that it was easier to travel to heaven. I thought, how poetic. But then also thinking about the shoe against the blue sky, the daytime of the sky, that it also marks the sky as a star. And so I started thinking about like amassing that. But then the other thing that was also interesting to me is that quite often these shoes often seem to be masculine shoes. So somehow the site always seemed to be claimed as a masculine space. So I thought, what would happen if I just flooded the ceiling with an amassing of women's shoes? So how I came to get so many of these shoes first happened when I bought some shoes that I saw like on eBay, and then somebody said, why aren't you just asking people? I just felt like it wasn't right to ask people. And then I put out on at the time when I was still on Facebook, then I asked people, hey, if you have any shoes that you'd like to get rid of, I would gladly take them. And that was the only request. And then beyond that, I made several trips to like, to like Goodwill or, to thrift stores, amassing them. So it's 1,500 pairs of shoes. So it's quite a heavy work, and they're all dipped in black glitter. I was also interested in like the contrast between the massing of shoes and thinking about birds in the sky. So, thinking about like a gathering of crows is also called a murder of crows. So also to playing on these lines, these kinds of dualities, and thinking about, small acts of memorializing.
So you mentioned Isaac Mendez Belisario. So you did a little art history on us. So I'm going to come back at you with some Zora Neale Hurston. So in 1933, she writes, on the walls of the homes of the average Negro, one always finds a glut of gaudy calendars, wall pockets, and advertising lithography. I saw a room in which the walls were gaily papered with Sunday supplements. There were 7 calendars and 3 wall pockets. One of them was decorated with a lace doily. The mantel shelf was covered with a scarf of deep homemade lace, looped up with a huge bow and pink crepe paper. Over the door was a huge lithograph showing the Treaty of Versailles, written with a Waterman fountain pen. It was grotesque, yes, but it indicated the desire for beauty. And decorating a decoration, as in the case of the doily on the gaudy wall pocket, did not seem out of place to the hostess. The feeling in back of such an act is that there can never be enough beauty, let alone too much.
That's a good place to end. I mean, what does it mean to live in a, like when I think, say, for example, about thinking about the garden as a metaphor and thinking about it in relation to a as a socio-economic kind of boundary. There's always been this critique of poor people. That poor people spend too much money on the wrong things. I remember reading this article about a young woman who was describing her mother who was getting dressed to go to the Social Security office to help an elderly neighbor. And she said to her mother, "Why are you putting on your pearls? We're just going to the Social Security office." And she said, "I dress up so that they could take us seriously." And so what happens then when people who do not have socioeconomic power or agency, that they also recognize that there is power in material? I mean, we live in a materialistic society and then we tell people to forget materials. I understand then why one would adorn one's life and splurge in the moments or on a life that may seem fleeting, because isn't all life fleeting anyway? We can't take it all into the grave. And even then, what's also really interesting is to see how people do take it to the grave, right? Do take it to the grave through pageantry, through the funeral, through a second line, through a bling funeral, to say, "I was here and you will not forget me."